I'm here with Trevor Flanery, who is a PhD in planning, governance, and globalization. He is an urban planning slash systems guy. So, how are you today, Trevor?
I'm good.
So, let's start off with the question of how can data visualization better help with economic development?
One of the issues we're having in contemporary society right now is trying to find your niche, or find your opportunities. If you've got a lot of a population that isn't finding work, isn't finding skills, isn't finding kind of an understanding of where people like them fit into society and what their future can be, you kind of had this whole problem of the information.
Right.
What information can you give them that would help them adopt the right behaviors to find the opportunities to make the whole thing keep working?
Yeah.
Right? And so at the basis of that are having ways of communicating, narrating data to the right population to allow them to integrate economically into the larger city. So those cities that are doing a really good job of innovating and creating opportunities and training people to take those opportunities and extend them are thriving. And those that kind of have 2, 3, or 5 lanes at various speeds for different populations to have an economic opportunity, it gets really hard.
Yeah.
They're struggling and their resentments build.
Right.
The technologies and the capacities are declining over time rather than improving, and it tends to drag a lot of the possibilities with it. So in a strange way, having a good story that helps people understand what the city needs, what the contributions should be, and how they can fit into that picture is fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
And the new tools, the ways that our society is kind of communicating that to each other is moving towards this data visualization aspect. The initial impetus behind a lot of things, they're calling smart cities approaches or science of cities. These are largely physical or physics or engineering systems. So highways, things that we can measure, energy usage, other patterns, things that you could find if you had credit card data.
Right.
These kinds of things. And then if you communicate that back to people generally, does that change their behavior in successively helpful ways that help an economy, adjust and compete better for profits and markets?
Yeah. Cool. So the tool that we've talked about is Tableau. Do you have like a very specific use case of how you or one of your teams that you've managed has used it to empower one of these underserved?
Well, I think one of the really strong components of Tableau is its spatial capacities and being able to geolocate data with a lot of other visual patterns. I mean, this isn't a kind of an extension and an outgrowth of a lot of the geographic information systems techniques, which are primarily kind of housed in government, but are becoming far more familiar to business users. And so having a simpler tool that allows you to just do a map without having to do all the pieces.
Right, just the whole point and click.
Right.
That completely changes.
Yeah, because
a lot of people.
A lot of data that we have doesn't exist structured well in a structured form that makes it easy to kind of understand nuance and difference and specificity. So big data can help you if you're a big group and a lot of your efforts are scaled. But if they're not, you need to understand the specific circumstances of the network and the population. You need to have some way to convey that specificity. I think Tableau does that very well.
That's really cool. So what is social entrepreneurship? That's something that came up in a conversation that we had last time we talked.
Yeah, well, if we put on our academic hats, I'm sure there's 100 definitions that different people would agree or disagree on. I tend to think of it as a nuanced look at nonprofits to say that they have to undertake innovation and adaptation just as every other institution in our society does.
Yeah.
So if you've got entrepreneurs in the capital business sector who are trying to create new business models. Nonprofits still have a business model and still have to adapt and innovate. And so it brings to bear different kinds of expertise, though, because they're focused on the performance of a lot of general systems in many cases. Can we advance this community? Can we advance education? Can we advance healthcare? Can we improve the lives of the aging or our youth populations that are getting ready to go into school and help them get their appropriate start in life? And so I think that any member of our society has a certain level of expertise, a certain level of experience, if only in their own life. And even if they're in a vulnerable, marginalized situation, that data is valuable, and their participation, therefore, is valuable. But it has to be kind of intentional. I mean, they have to understand that what they see, what they perceive, and what they understand matters to the larger effort. And so this focus on entrepreneurship, whether it be social or technology or business, it's really talking about how to make better decisions and do better problem solving. And I think that those people that are trying to use the tools that the tech sector has kind of developed and bring it back to existing models or create entirely new models of nonprofit and philanthropic efforts, it's just another form of problem solving that is funded in a different way and targeted at a different output.
Well, because I can see that the models that I have developed to impact a survey for one of my consulting clients, I'm now seeing that there's so many lessons, approaches that apply directly to quantifying the impact of a nonprofit and getting funding secured for them. And I'm starting to get more and more kind of in that middle gray area space and talking to other people in that space. Like, for instance, I talked to this girl that's out of Bozeman, Montana, and she does consulting for nonprofits. She said she's been in that space for, I think, maybe 5 to 10 years, and she's seen a big shift from the way that they get funding. It used to be they would get these big grants, or now it's shifting from 80% was funding 10 years ago through that way to now individuals are getting 80% of the funds are coming from individual donors.
Right.
So now what you can do through data visualization is you can start to segment the individuals by taste preference. Say you have a nonprofit that does good work in Africa, and there's probably malaria, there's malaria, water, and maybe civic, like keeping the peace. The segments of the people who are funding might care about 3 different things. So it's the same as like a segmenting for a marketing campaign.
Right. And I think that having that segmentation allows a certain level of expertise to, and passion and compassion to kind of target. But you need to be able to communicate the overall system so that you don't have the bottlenecks or the gaps, so that everybody, you see this with like academic philanthropy. Nobody wants the sewer plant named after them now. So
that makes sense.
Some stuff's sexier than others when you think about donating, but that doesn't mean that it isn't critical to health and the performance of that effort. So if you're able to convey all the pieces and what the priorities are, and I think we're getting better at this with Kickstarter and GoFundMe and things like that, there's becoming a more common infrastructure that allows people to directly and with a lot more precision focus their resources towards what they're trying to accomplish, in the nonprofit sector.
Interesting. So what I just scribbled down was, it sounds like if somebody was trying to get their foot in the door in the economic development nonprofit space, it might be a good idea for them to learn a tool like Tableau or some type of data handling system. Have you, the entry-level people that you've hired, did they have any Tableau experience, or did you train them or Was that kind of a
Well, I had limited hiring experience in this space, but the staff that I have worked with trained themselves.
Okay.
They had other experience with other platforms, and
yeah?
kind of took it on them to experiment and see what
Right.
worked and learn from each other, and do the videos and those things. I think that you need to understand the tools and the audience, and then be sensitive to what information matters, and how it has to be presented in a way that can have an impact.
Right.
But again, that's going to change over time. There's a certain bias you fall into with a lot of this work where you end up presenting the data you have.
Yeah.
And you hope that that can inform people's work because it gives them something to think about where we are and where we want to be.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's not structured properly, it's not disaggregated properly, it very much limits what you can do.
Yeah.
So you need to understand not just the analytics side, but how the kind of raw materials of analytics becomes a
Right.
visualization.
Yeah.
And be sensitive to the dynamics of that. You can learn most of the pieces, but you do need to have a strength somewhere in the spectrum that allows you to contribute while you're picking up the other skill
Something to
sets.
kind of root down on while you're
Yeah.
learning the other pieces.
Yeah. Because once you've got that piece and you know where it fits, you can begin to add the other modules.
Yeah. That makes sense. The way that I learned was I took a quantitative analytics class in my MBA, and it taught me Excel. And then Excel's pretty easy to use. It's not easy to automate, but you can kind of build these very simplistic systems. And then I did that for about a year till I got my first exposure to building out data visualization, and it just sat right on top of that quantitative analytics foundation that I built out. Yeah, so that makes sense. I get that. One of the things that I thought was interesting getting more into this space was I worked with some university data that was done by PhDs, and it was a question. Each question was like this long. It was like a paragraph.
Yeah.
And it was like, due to the confluence of circumstance, we strongly believe, but blah, 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 blah.
Caveat.
And it was like, all they had to say was, is it this? Question mark. And me going in and just transforming. So I think what happens with a lot of PhDs is they just talk to themselves.
No, I think they're used to defending things.
So they have to, that's why they have to.
Yeah, when you know that people who understand all the ins and outs or nuances of a specific topic are going to be kicking your tires. You become an expert in tires.
Yeah.
Even if that is not at all what you started with. And sometimes you get very interested in something and then it moves. And you need to kind of...
What do you mean by that? It moves.
Well, you're going into a gray area, right? You're trying to find the gap in knowledge. To get a PhD, you have to make a contribution. You have to discover something people haven't discovered before. But you're doing that under the watchful eyes of other doctors who, specialize in these things, who care about their piece, and you want to know where you fit. So you can't be out there all alone. Your contribution has to be anchored with everything else, and there's specific terms that convey that. So that's where you start to see a paragraph where it could have been a sentence.
Well, what's interesting though is that seems to be in direct conflict with visual analytics. Like, visual analytics best practices is a lot of it's pre-attentive, so you immediately see it. Like, okay, this box is red, bad. To where I haven't worked with a lot in that space, but it seemed like they were making it very, very convoluted and complex.
Yeah, well, they have to, because you've got to talk about the theory behind what you're doing, the basis of knowledge itself. The kind of assumed theoretical background of this, all the pieces of it, how that gets built out. And you have to identify all this
Yeah.
and direct it to the work that's been done in the past. And that does tend to pull you off target, but it also keeps you honest because you have to constantly reference other people
Right.
and other things. You can't just go, I'm going there.
And then
And
yeah.
and then you present some data, which isn't backed up, isn't put in context.
Yeah.
Has a lot of, like, for example, mapping. You can do a lot of things with mapping that make people
Like
think.
a geo?
Yeah, you can make people think certain things just based on the projection that you choose. You know, you can look at a world map, and you know, if Greenland is the size of South America, you know, it's designed to show where things are relative to each other, not relative shape, how big they are.
I've never heard that before.
And so during the Cold War, big red polar areas around Russia looked very scary. So you can do things with maps. You know, you have to make trade-offs because you're taking a round,
Right. I have heard that
kind of spherical globe
Yeah.
and then trying to flatten it. And so you can err on the side of making things the right sizes, or you can err on the side of making things put them in the right places, so you can navigate with that map, nautical map, for example.
Interesting.
So how this plays out in data is whatever you emphasize matters more than what you don't. And you can be intentional about that. You can be very unconscious about it. And so if I were to go into a business environment where it's quick, straight to the point, there's an assumed cultural understanding, shorthand that people are working from, which make things potentially more efficient, more speed.
Potentially.
Yeah.
So, are there any? Well, that's funny that you said potentially. Is there a specific instance where you can point to where these KPIs, what we're tracking, is not? This is wrong.
Nothing springs to mind, but an example I would give is sort of, you look at education rates, for example, and all the numbers that you can have around education. Do they ultimately tell you how well that person would perform at a specific task? I mean, there's a reason why when you apply for college, they got 5 or 6 metrics, right?
Yeah.
And even then, you don't just take someone's transcript and say you get the job. You talk to them.
Right.
You know, you see what other things they've done. You get very much into the specifics and personalization of the data, because this is going to be a relationship, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think that a lot of data was very relational for a very long time. And now we have this pseudo-relational data going on with Facebook and a lot of the social media, that it can give you a lot of hard data about the soft data, but it still doesn't tell you much about the person.
Really? You expand upon that? Like what?
Well,
So.
Just because I shopped at certain places or did certain things,
Doesn't mean that you're.
yeah, it's the same thing. Like if I were a financial advisor,
Yeah.
past performance is not an indicator of future performance.
Yeah, that's true. Especially.
Everything is situationally dependent. And so you have to be able to communicate the situation as well as the specific and how that changes. And if people are self-aware and participating in that process, watching themselves go through their day and getting their own data, that changes behavior as well. You see this with something called net metering. So if someone were to put the electric meter for your power company inside your home, and you could watch it in real time, it could tell which devices you cut on were affected.
Oh, your power usage go way down, right?
Oh yeah, because there's an instant feedback loop between behavior and the data.
Yeah.
And so as we begin to see more data become available in our cars, on our social media, and we see our own metrics in the Fitbits,
Right.
it allows for new feedback loops. it shifts the behaviors.
Yeah, it's really interesting talking to you because you're getting more into the psychology of data, to where I sit is more of, you're right. I've got this established culture of, this is a manufacturing plant. Here are the KPIs. They want to know sales. They want to know in-stock percentages. They want to know average inventory on hand. And like I can point to specific situations where they need to shift. Like for instance, if they're selling marine accessories and the sales volumes, of course, goes like this up during the summer and then drops during the winter, and it's pretty predictable. And if they're holding on to this inventory all winter long, it's like, hey, you just need to switch that.
Yeah.
It's very simple. Like what you're dealing with is like a whole level of complexity beyond.
But you're also focused on what can be measured. It's physical and timing, and it can be engineered.
Yeah.
But it can also break down. There's not redundancy, if there's supply chain problems, if there's new tariffs introduced.
Right.
Then the globalized world starts to interfere. The data can help you work through the logistics of that because, it's real.
Mm-hmm.
But human behavior, it can be more fluid. You can have cascades. You can have entrenched patterns that make no sense.
Yeah.
They formed under specific conditions, and culturally they're clung to, even though those conditions are no longer beneficial to them or others. And so that's where using data in new ways and getting people used to engaging in data and getting people used to assessing their own behaviors and using these tools, it's kind of opening up more opportunity. But you're right, we're figuring it out. It's a very experimental space. It's not something that is concretely understood, easily engineered. And you wouldn't necessarily want that, because social engineering that isn't participatory has historically gone very wrong.
I do really like being in this data visualization space, because it's kind of a mixture of, I do get to be creative, and that's kind of why I like being an entrepreneur as well. So I like solving problems. I like kind of thinking outside and drawing relationships amongst things that seem to be somewhat unrelated. But I also like having that data as a foundation. But yeah, I haven't really thought about it as far as the data that I am using as my foundation is this big versus everything else that's going on.
Yeah, this is a more academic question.
Yeah, because I feel like you're getting
at what point does data blindness become a paradigm blindness? Where
explain that in non-academic.
Okay,
I know what a paradigm is, like the way you think about something, right?
Yeah, I mean your own theory about things, and to what extent does your, and I'll forgive the term, your addiction to specific data keep you from perceiving alternative situations? And I think we're seeing this a bit with the crisis of authority around the news and the media, fake news, and Russian intervention, and the ways that you can manipulate using very specific kinds of signaling and interactions and faking, bots and everything else to create false narratives and false cascades of information. It's creating a crisis of authority. And so as these tools become more sophisticated, everyone else is having to get more sophisticated and understand things about data that, people who didn't have the internet not so long ago are now having to learn about what's a bot versus what's another human being. And this person who I've never heard of is trying to friend me. What are they up to?
Yeah.
What do they really represent? So our own theories about cooperation, our own paradigms about our own, norms around cooperation are dependent on the signals in these interactions. And now they've all been thrown up in the air. And in real time, we're having to relearn how to protect ourselves, how to signal cooperation, how to signal trust, and we build a relationship around that achieves our needs, get the information and resources that we need. But we're in this period right now where we're kind of going towards comfortable. So if we're hearing something that we're familiar with and that we generally are comfortable with, and that's where our comfort space, then that's the information that we're going to gravitate towards.
So you're saying we're getting more and more polarized?
Well, yeah, in part. But I think that the groupthink is consistent. The potential for groupthink is more consistent. As birds of a feather continue to flock together, that's a normal process for almost any group.
Didn't we go through a very similar time during like McCarthyism, yellow journalism, where everything was sensationalized and it kind of divided everything?
I mean, a kind of tribal approach to information is consistent. But when you have to interact with other people different from you, you will form bonds across the usual barriers.
Yeah.
So what we know from urban science is having public spaces, particularly those that have a lot of economic activity around them, will create business networks across other social divisions. Personal relationships will as well. So money and sex can transcend things that societies spend a lot of time and money in the past trying to keep apart. This group and this group are not to interact. These are the rules under penalty of severe consequences. So now we're doing it to ourselves without, these other legal or military kind of impetus around it. And we're flailing, right? Because the old assumptions don't work.
Interesting.
And so learning to assess reputation, learning to assess a situation, learning which tools function well for navigating an environment and finding opportunities and finding resources are fundamental. And that's why you're seeing so much change in these spaces. Because you have a great hunger from the population for tools that work.
Mm-hmm.
You have a tremendous capacity being unleashed by these very cheap, very simple tools like Tableau.
Yeah.
So you got the customer and you got the possibility. And so now we're just trying to find a model that is secure enough and functional enough that if people begin to learn the platform, they can then have access to everything that a city or an economy has to offer.
Yeah, I've noticed, I have messed around with the city of Greensboro's data and looked at crime data and those statistics. And that was actually the first visualization I ever built out on Tableau Public, was looking at crime data over time.
Mm-hmm.
I just built a very simple chart that you could filter between the main crimes that happen and then see if it's trending up or trending down. So yeah, that was interesting. It was the first time that I thought, I'm going to take this tool and I'm going to learn something about what's going on around me.
Yeah, and the sooner those games.
You're saying like that was a game that I played with myself?
In a sense, I mean, you're trying to, take some component, you're playing with it, right?
Yeah,
seeing
that's
what you can
definitely
do with it.
what I do a lot.
And so, as we learn as a culture to have younger and younger people get more familiar with what's possible, do
Mm-hmm.
problem solving with these kinds of tools, imagine the expertise and the skill sets they'll have by the time they leave high school. I mean, but you want to have it be done early. You want people to get familiar with the tools that their society is going to run on as early as possible and turn them into games so that they're fun and they can engage in them in a creative way rather than, this is a horrible project, I hate this stuff, why am I having to learn it? They're actually pursuing something that interests them and using the tool to extend their expertise in that.
Well, that's what I do with my students. Is I I don't think that any of their teachers so far have sat them down and said, "Hey," I think part of it I think is because they're in these big classrooms, first of all.
Right.
But sitting down with them one on one and like, what does your ideal job look like? And then we're like, what would you like to do? What are you interested in? And then what's the problem within that space? And then using Tableau or some type of visualization tool to solve that specific problem.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I'm doing in my consulting practice. It's just I have my business partner bring in, his connection, and they're a marketing agency that they have this big survey and they want to figure out how to cluster the respondents and then target each cluster effectively.
Right.
That sounds really interesting to me. It's like, what? Let's figure out the psychology.
Right.
And that's
because you're learning so much. You're not just
Yeah.
solving an economic problem that allows you to be
Right.
compensated well. You're also learning a lot about the way the world works.
Yeah, and I'm also learning models that then I can build another model, slightly tweak it, and then all of a sudden I've got a nonprofit impact analysis. Like that's, but hitting that critical mass of learning is I kind of like stumbled into it.
Mm-hmm.
Like I actually in my MBA I didn't have there was not a single moment in class where they talked about Tableau and showed it to me. What I did was I found an internship and used that as my catalyst. So I was actually in the real world. I wasn't
Right.
I think I go back and forth sometimes thinking whether I wasted my time with the MBA. I don't think so. When I first graduated, I was like, why did I do this? I could have just like got an internship or worked in a job and then learned Tableau on the job.
Huh.
But I will
Would you
say,
understand the client very well, though?
what?
Would you understand your clients as well?
Well, yeah, I think that the MBA classes taught me, we did a bunch of case studies and I saw a bunch of essentially ways to solve these businesses' problems. But now I'm just using this tool to do it, which seems, it's funny, it's not unique in the global sense, but in Greensboro, North Carolina, there are very few people who are using Tableau to solve business problems.
This is some academic research that I came across pretty early, because I was interested in which populations create new businesses.
Oh, that's interesting.
So all these universities were creating these entrepreneurial environments and co-working spaces and startup support structures and contests and all these things. And the professors were by and large not really playing. They're creating a lot of potential intellectual property, but they weren't necessarily interested in becoming entrepreneurs. They had kind of gone in a trajectory of publishing and getting grants and developing technology. So what would happen would be that the graduate students would leave, they'd go get jobs, they'd start in some company, they'd say, wait, we solved this, why are we doing it this stupid way? My own professor had these concepts that fixed this, and so they suffer for 18 months, and then they can't take it anymore. They leave, start their own company, bring that back to their original company and any other competitors, and they're off and rolling.
Yeah.
So it's a population that can take the risk. It's just getting started. Is learning both worlds and having a frustration about that, seeing the opportunity.
Yeah.
And so, but they're in that place personally where
you described me to
both.
a T. That's fantastic.
Well,
that's crazy that you.
Well, there are populations like Arlington, Virginia, targets people like you for that reason. And so they use the business and the mapping software and data like that to create Disneyland for people like you to kind of grow their county.
Yeah.
Now, this has a certain.
Is that Virginia Tech, Arlington?
No, that's just southwest of D.C. So that's sort of the Virginia side of Washington, D.C.
So that's where I do feel like I'm in a no man's land because there are not very many people I can talk to about the way that I specifically geek out about how I'm problem solving and creating this.
Yeah, I mean, it does, and that is a problem, right? For Greensboro to kind of capture the energy and the potential, it has to kind of create a bit more of a structured effect so that people like you can scale. and feel a part of something
Yeah.
in a way. Whereas you can go to some area of Silicon Valley or Arlington and maybe get drowned because you're in a sea of people and it's difficult to find your footing. So the point being, there's specific ways that our society is changing, and that has opportunities and trade-offs involved with it. But in your own journey, which is maybe feel fairly peripheral to you, but maybe fairly common across the country for people that are entrepreneurs, where they were kind of being set along the standard line, discovered they had a shortcut or an idea or concept that saved money or time or created value, and they jumped on it because that's kind of personality that they were, and they want to associate with people that think like that.
Well, I will say HQ Greensboro, I am surrounded by people who are in that mindset.
Right.
I worked at a large European company that is in between Greensboro and Winston-Salem, just for 2 consecutive internships, and I was miserable because I just felt like they kind of stuffed my creativity out.
Yeah.
And I actually just did the Simon Sinek Start With Why through I did the Chamber of Commerce is doing like an incubator program for small businesses, and I went last night, and one of the top 5 was creativity and learning.
Yeah.
Like creative problem solving and learning is kind of that. It doesn't pay my bills, but it gets me up in the morning.
Right.
I get kind of a rush when I have the breakthrough. I'm like, oh,
yeah,
these things together.
So how would you organize the society around that?
How would I organize this?
So if you have a gig economy where you've got a certain amount of crowdsourced funds, you've got a large problem set with a bounty connected to it, and people wake up and they're not really sure what they're going to do. They check a list of options. They work on it. They get compensated for a certain amount of that. But how are they going to get their health care? How are they going to get the more stable payments so that they can work on these different projects? It could be nonprofit, it could be for-profit.
According to my sisters, I should just get a job and grow up.
The jobs are
and then work on the side.
More to the side hustles. Things are getting more atomized, but the human being still has its basic needs and its need for, a more stable system. So these things are in tension right now, right? You had the 1970s model, where
You work for 30 years.
Yeah, the Cold War to the end, and you have a pension.
Yeah.
And, employer provided health care and state subsidized education. Now, you've got gigantic student loans. You may or may not have state funded health care and job security is out the window. And you're responsible for becoming a very, very proficient investor if you want a nest egg at the end of everything.
See,
and so there's a lot more opportunity, there's a lot more instability, there's a lot more restructuring. And all of these things are happening at the same time. And that's where a lot of the tensions and the fights because you're trying to have philosophical battles or moral battles about what, to someone like me, are more systemic issues that need to be sorted. It's not about whether we are generating enough economic value or distributing that value sufficiently throughout the society to keep the society from collapsing and being able to fund its different infrastructure. It's having both.
yeah.
If you're not creating enough economic activity in your location, you're going broke. And if you're creating tremendous value, but it's finding its way into various accounts, which never really quite make it into the small businesses and supply lines and other workers and neighbors where you are, they're going broke. And their loyalty to that system that you're enjoying the benefits of is declining. So we have to find a way to strike the different balances dynamically, to try and find a way for these systems to continue onward, but also change form as they do so. in data and visualizing things and figuring out how to come to a common understanding consistently around what we should do, what we should invest, and how we should move forward on that collective level, which is more the government and nonprofit background I have. So,
Yeah.
but with those platforms in place, business can then do what it does best.
Interesting. Well, have any closing remarks?
No.
Well, I appreciate your time, man.
Yeah.
Well, hope you guys enjoyed it.